Hello, everyone. I'm Daisy Shu. I'm currently the ISER Young Investigator representative, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural ISER YI seminar series. We have 4 interviews today with amazing scientists in eye research who have traversed the globe and successfully navigated an international research career in both academia and industry. A big thank you to our ISER committee members, Dr. Cecilia Chao and Dr. Tirthankar Sinha, for their hard work in organizing this seminar and interviewing our speakers. A few housekeeping items: we will be recording the seminar today and we will provide this recording afterwards. For now, please mute and turn off your videos during the interviews. And without further ado, please enjoy these interviews.
My name is Cecilia Chao from University of Houston College of Optometry.
I'm Tirthankar Sinha, postdoc in UT Health in Houston.
We welcome you, and today we're going to talk about the unspoken secrets of being an international scientist. We're very honored to have Professor Paloma Liton from Duke University as our first guest. Professor Liton, do you mind to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Paloma Liton. So I am originally from Spain. So I came here to the US 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, and I came as a postdoctoral fellow, and then I became a faculty member in the same place at Duke University, and I have been at Duke since then for 20 years, and I am still trying to be a successful investigator, so I'm still working on that.
But it helps with the networkings, right? Because it's easier relatively easier, I think.
Yeah, for me to get working, it was difficult. So my PhD, I am a molecular biologist, so I did my master degree in molecular biology, and then I made my PhD in virology. So I was new to ophthalmology, in Spain. So I did my PhD in Spain, and then I was new to the ophthalmology field. So the project was going to be to apply virology into gene therapy. I don't know viral gene therapy, but at the end, things moved to another direction. So now I'm working with lysosomes and biology. But yeah, it's a long process. It's a long process, and you all are international, so you know how challenging and difficult it is, especially also because you have to deal with all the immigration, all the visa, and then the opportunities are smaller. There are a lot of grants, the postdoctoral grants you can apply to NIH because you are not a US citizen, you are not a green card holder, so there are some foundations. So I was lucky to get some grants from foundations, but not everything is open, and then you are restricted to your lab. So if you don't like your lab, you cannot live freely, right? So there are some challenges there, being an international student.
When do you decide, or what is the reason you decide to stay in the United States instead of returning back home to Spain?
Yeah. So I think I took the decision between the year 3 and 4. Because you need to belong someplace. You have to organize your life. You are getting older, and after 3-year postdoc, you have had a taste of what is being a researcher in the US, and usually you have still some contacts in your country. So if you want to go back, you can still go back. I think if you wait a little longer, then it's too late. Then you start to create roots here, and most importantly, you also miss and you lose all your contacts from your original country.
So just following up on that one, as you said, changing from one visa to another, what immigration changes or statuses have you been through? So because there are a lot of international investigators. So.
I came with a J1, so this is a non-resident visa. So it has pros and cons. So I think it's a great visa to come to the US. And also for spouses, it's a good visa because the J4 allows work permit for your spouse. So I think that's one of the major advantages. You don't pay taxes. So that's a good starting one. But obviously, if you decide to stay in the US, you need to change your visa. So I was lucky that I was not. I was this 2-year exempt, so I didn't have to go back to Spain, so I was able to stay here. So from the J1, I transitioned to H1, And the H1 has pros and cons. One of the major cons of the H1, when in my time, I think it changed now, is that your partner, your spouse cannot work. So H4 is very, very bad visa. So the H1, the good thing with the H1 is that it's a resident visa. So if you study, then you can pay in tuitions, all these things. But for spouses, is the worst one. And then when I was doing that, when I was under the age, is when I started with the green card process. So in my case, I have two green card processes at the same time. It was when I transitioned to faculty to Duke. I started the process paid by the university, but because things was not very clear, the timing and everything, I also started the process by myself. So I applied as a national interest waiver. And then I am lucky, I am from Spain, I was able to apply both processes at the same time. So the 130 and then the actual green card. So, and it was a very quick process. I think I got the green card once it was accepted in 6 months.
Wow.
But it was a little stressful because the day that we submitted our green card for the first time, the US shut down the green card program. So the Duke green card never made it. Our personal green card arrived the very same day. So it was stamped that day. So it was stressful. I mean, you know what is this?
Yeah.
And then after 5 years with the green card, I became a US citizen.
Yes, so you can apply all the grants that you can for the government.
And with the green card, for me, the citizenship, it was, okay, now I can vote. But I remember when I received the green card, and it was December 24th. So it was like, okay, Santa brought me the green card, because you feel like you're, for the first time, a person here, right? And you're free. I don't depend on my PIs. If things don't work, I can go outside and I can work wherever. I don't have to leave the country in 1 month. And that's the major problem with the H1s, is if something happens, you need to leave the country and your life in 1 month. And this is something that most people, non-international, don't understand what it put on us being international students, having this. I need to do whatever they are asking me to do, no matter what. If not, I need to leave. So green card, it was incredible. It was really, really, really amazing. It was really good.
Great, good to know. And then I think we cover a little bit of the funding situation. If you're being international student, it's very difficult. That's why I know that's the reason you pursue getting the green card, make you more stable in terms of the job and also funding opportunity. Would you suggest, as a young investigator like me or like Tirthankar, would suggest them to their PI to sponsor their green card application?
So obviously it changed from one institution to another. In my time, Duke my institution was not sponsoring green cards for postdocs. Now I think it depends on the PI. I just sponsor a green card for my research associate, and he got the green card some months ago. So I think PIs should consider always try to help the people who are in your lab to get a stable situation and to get the green card.
Yeah, this was Cecilia mentioned this to me, and this was really new information for me, that such a thing can happen, because all I have heard mostly is like when they reach a tenure track position, then the university applies. But I did not know.
Yeah, so you cannot use NIH funding to do that. So you need to use your discretionary funding. You cannot. It's not sponsored by Duke University, so Duke University didn't sponsor it was sponsored by them, by Duke, but it was paid by my discretionary account. So it can be done, but it depends on the PI. And on the other hand, you have the H1 situation. There's a time in which the H1 expires also, and you cannot apply to more. So I think perhaps because I am an international student and I went through that, so I was a little bit more willing to sponsor green cards, but obviously it depends on the PI and also on the institution. But my advice for everyone is, as soon as you decide you're going to stay, start pursuing the green card. It makes a difference. It's your life, basically.
Yeah. How would us approach the PI to convince them, hey, can you give us a green card? Or like working you for a longer time?
I think it depends mostly on the PI. You can ask the PI and you can, say, I am willing to perhaps stay 1 year. One of the major problems with the green card is that once you get your green card, you can leave the lab. So you have made an investment and you pay the process, the lawyer and everything, and then the person who is in the lab can say, well, now I am leaving. So my approach was a little similar to what some of the companies do, is I'm going to sponsor the green card, but the condition is that you need to stay 1 year in the lab. If you don't stay 1 year in the lab, then you will need to, I can ask you to return this, all these attorney fees and that we pay, because one of the statements that you need to do when you apply for a green card is that your intention is to stay in that job position. So in that case, my staff member, I knew that it was an understanding, so it was very clear. So I think that's a starting point to ask the PI, well, this is a situation, we are with the H1, and the H1 is a visa that if you have an spouse, he or she cannot work. My kids at the school, they are also considered, they are not, they cannot apply to many of the things because they are not residents, they are not green card. I would like to move forward. Which are the chances of the university to sponsor the fees and the attorneys of the green card process? And I understand that this is very costly, blah, 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 and I will make possible for me to stay at least 6 months, 1 year. I don't have any intention to leave the lab. So I think it's the most important, trust, be honest, both parts, and make sure that you are not just getting the green card because you are going to leave. It's because you want to make your status a little more stable in the country.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I would just ask one thing regarding the investment from the PI on this aspect. That can you give sort of like a ballpark figure of how much
7,000.
roughly?
About
7,000. Okay.
Yeah.
But once that person gets, that person can also apply separately for the spouse, right?
Yeah. So what is being usually done is the department, the PI pays for that for the investigator, and then the investigator pays for the family. So they process everything at the same time, but with the lawyer. But the family fees are being paid by the staff member. But that can be done, but obviously depends. Also, don't assume that the PI don't want to sponsor H1s, because now it's happening. H1s, there are several labs that they are not sponsoring H1s or green cards, especially if they are national, if they are citizens. They don't understand how the process. So I think indeed the university should educate also the PIs on the process of immigration and the green cards and all the type of visas, because most of the PIs don't know anything about this. They haven't gone through this process as you have gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Don't assume that there is, bad.
No, it's a great advice for all international young investigators that if once you build the trust, probably just go and talk, because like you said, the person probably doesn't know even he or she wants to help, but has no clue.
Yeah.
This discussion and interview is very helpful for us in terms of like young investigator, if we plan to stay, what we should do, and then if we leave,
absolutely.
later. And then we really appreciate your time.
We have today Dr. Rahel Zulliger as part of our special guest series. We'll let Rahel introduce herself.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Rahel Zulliger. As you already said, I was born and raised in Switzerland, in Europe, and I now work at a pharma company here in Basel called Roche, and I am a research project manager there.
I have known Rahel from before while she was still in the US. So we were wondering if for those scholars who are probably thinking of transitioning from Europe to US and also maybe from US to Europe, if you can tell us what different career stages you have been since PhD and in which countries.
Yeah, so that's actually a short list. I did my PhD here in Switzerland, where I also studied. And after I did get my PhD, I moved to the United States for my postdoc studies. That's pretty much it. So then after that, I did move back to Switzerland, where I work now at Roche.
So how long you have been stay in the United States? Is it like during the postdoc period only?
Yes, it was a postdoc period thing. So I was there for 6 years at two different universities. First in University of Oklahoma, and then University of Houston.
When and what are the reasons you decided to go back home?
Yeah, so I have to say, in my career, the decisions are always a bit connected to serendipity. So it's always like it's always when opportunities pop up is when decisions are made in my case. So when I moved to Houston after 5 years in Oklahoma, I always kind of started thinking about my future, because if you've been a postdoc for 5 years, it's time to think about it.
Okay.
So I did think about going back before too, but I didn't mind staying in the US. But as you can probably imagine, it's difficult, especially in academia, to find a job other than a postdoc.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a decision of like just to start looking,
Yeah.
and that's where serendipity struck. So I opened up the Arvo job page, and the first job that popped up was a research scientist at Roche, and they were looking for somebody in the ophthalmology department, and the job description was pretty much me reading it like.
Yeah.
So I applied for it. I got an interview the week after, and they literally hired me off the spot. So that's pretty much what happened. It's, to be perfectly honest, not a lot of thinking from my side. It was just like that one decision to go look for jobs, and that's pretty much what it was.
Transitioning from the academia to industry, was that a tricky thing for you, or like you said, it was a serendipity thing, but the position you applied was of an industry position, right?
Yes.
So did you have any inhibitions or thoughts, and how did they turn up when in practicality?
I think we all have that inhibition at the beginning when we look at industry jobs, but we also all think about it, right? One of the things that everybody thinks, and that is true, is you do get paid better in industry. I don't think that's a secret anymore. But a lot of people have like misgivings on what industry jobs look like, and so did I. The one major thing in industry is you're no longer the generalist. So when you work in academia, you're pretty much everything. You're a biologist, you're a surgeon, you're a pharmacist, you're a chemist, you're an animal caretaker, the biostatistician. So you do everything on your own, and it is expected of you to solve every problem pretty much on your own. And the biggest difference to that is when you go to industry is for every problem, you have a specialist. So you're not actually supposed to be doing all by yourself. You're supposed to ask the person who knows how to do it. So this is the biggest change, I think, from an academia job to industry. Industry doesn't want you to be a generalist. They want you to be the specialist you are.
So the job responsibilities are as exactly what they are in the advertisement. There are not any hidden responsibilities expected of you.
Pretty much. On the other hand, though, they do expect you to be a learner, to learn new things, but in your area.
I know you stayed in United States for 6 years, and then what visa status were you at? And were you like, when you're doing the academic field, have you ever thought of like stay in United States for a longer time period?
Yeah, so that's actually the question that was kind of popping up right when I moved to Houston, because at that point I had been on a J1 visa for 5 years, which is the maximum you can have. So right before I moved to Houston, I applied for an H1B, which was granted, and I could have technically stayed on that one for another 5 years. But at that point in time, if I wouldn't have left, I would have applied for a green card because it's just the easier thing to do.
Going back to your joining the industry and how your experience has been in there, because I guess there are some concept of going like vertically or horizontally up the ladder in industry, right? So especially in big companies, people think it's very different from smaller companies. So can you give us some inputs on that? What are your thoughts? What have you seen or experienced?
So that's actually one of the biggest differences on how jobs are, how people like move in industry compared to like academia, right? Because in academia, as a postdoc, there's literally pretty much one career path, and that's up. So you can try to become an associate professor, and then for the rest of your life hunt down tenure that you will never achieve. So that's pretty much the only way. There's no side routes. There's no different specialties that you could go into. In industry, that's completely different, because in industry, there's so many more jobs associated with your field that moving sideways is extremely easy, and it's encouraged, in fact. So there is options to like do rotations in other departments. There's options to do like a 20% like thing on the side in a different department if you feel like that is going to help you move sideways. So that's actually what I did. I moved sideways because I was a research scientist in drug discovery, and now I'm a project manager, which is not technically up, it's more like sideways up.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons in industry versus academia?
That's actually something I had to think about for a bit, because it's not actually as much as you would think. The difference is really not that big. And people do have misgivings about that are just simply not true. And you will hear it from both sides, right? People will claim one and the other. But if you've worked in both places, the difference actually like minimal. And they don't get like the cheap postdocs, which is also only partially true. We actually do have postdocs in industry. So you can have a 3-year postdoc at Roche if you would feel like to do that. The one thing that people are scared about is that in industry, we're not allowed to share science, which, is true to a certain degree, because we are having like, you have IP rights. Let's just say people are more cautious about talking about things. But it doesn't mean that we don't publish. We do publish. We do go to conferences. It might be a little less, and people are more careful on what they're talking about. But especially for basic science stuff, we do collaborate. We do talk to people. We do go to conferences.
Like, you don't need to worry about funding.
That's the other thing. And to be perfectly honest, people will be like, well, in industry, everything is about the business. It's just a business case, which is true to a certain degree, sure, because we have to make money. But let's face it, everybody who has like submitted a grant proposal lately knows that is also happening in academia. Like, you have to think about what your business case is if you want to get funding. You can't just talk about some obscure field nobody cares about. You will not get funding. So it's exactly the same thing. You need to have a business case.
Okay. Wow, great. So would you say you miss something in academia which you don't find in the industry?
Yeah, it's probably that, things are maybe a little easier every once in a while, because in academia the rules are not as strict for certain things, and you can still mess around with things that you probably shouldn't in academia. Yeah, and that's because we're actually judged by the public very differently, right? If there is something happening at the universities, be like, well, they're researchers, what can you do? And if anything happens at a pharma industry, we get judged really harshly, even though it might be the same reason and the same accident. So they have to be more careful.
Do you think the postdoc training can help the transition for your current job?
Actually, I personally really enjoyed my postdoctoral time, and I think it's a great experience for people to do it, because it will probably allow you to go to a different country. You will learn to do things differently by sometimes duct taping things together just because there's no money to replace it. It gives you a great insight into how things really work. I think it's great to do a postdoc in academia. It's a good preparation for later life because you kind of get pretty good at, doing things from scratch, getting things together like that might have just been offered to you in an industry job where you don't really have to do it, where money isn't the issue, right? That's a big thing. So you learn how to do things with less money, and that's never a bad thing. I think that's a life school that everybody could use.
Do you have any tips that you want to share with like young investigators if they are planning to transition from like PhD, postdoc to industry internationally?
Yes, I think the biggest thing is get a job before you move. It does make things way easier with, visa applications and moving, because otherwise you're going to be in an eternal limbo to get a job. So try to get a job first. They will help you get a visa if you have a job. And the second thing is, I think what people are still afraid of sometimes when you see the job ads that industry puts out, because they look a little different than from academia. It just says like postdoc in the field of, right? That's pretty much it. And if you look at the industry ads, they have like very detailed, this is what we want you to be, this is what we want you to be able to do. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't apply for it, even if it doesn't completely cover what you can do or what your experience is, because they actually put a lot more emphasis in you being able to adapt and to be willing to learn. So the industry is looking for people who are willing to get into a job, not who are already perfect at it.
Okay.
So that's the bigger emphasis. So don't be afraid to apply for it, even if you feel like I can't do that.
All right.
Right.
That's great. We learned a lot from you today. And I would like to thank you for your time and like share your experience with us. We know more about how the transition from postdoc, from US, from other country, and really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahel.
Hi everyone, I would like to introduce our Australian guest, Dr. Nicole Kart. She's currently a scientist senior lecturer in University of New South Wales. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Cecilia, and hello, Turkey.
So, Nicole, do you mind to introduce yourself a little bit and about your career path?
Thank you, Cecilia. So I am one of those PhD students who came to their PhD quite late, and this happens quite a lot in optometry. I graduated through University of New South Wales in 1989, and I remember when we had a final year research project, Brian Holden asked myself and my research partner to his office, and he said, well, I heard that your presentation was really good, and would you be interested in doing a PhD? And immediately I went like, oh no, I like being at university, I'm going to go and make some money and do what I've been trained to do. I worked in Australia and in the UK for 5 years each as an optometrist. And after the UK, where practice was a little bit different at that time, it was very commercially focused, and I felt I had lost a bit of my healthcare practitioner role. I would like to do another challenge, and I ended up going back to Brian Holden, and I worked there for 9 years as a clinical research optometrist. I had 2 kids, and life was good. They had very good childcare. They understood. We did a lot of industry work, so we had lots of trips to the US, trips to conferences. My son was going to school, and I wanted to spend more time with him, and I felt like I needed to do a PhD or do some further study to move forward in my field. I started a PhD. I got a postdoc scholarship from the Australian government before I had finished my PhDs. And that fellowship was to move to the UK for 2 years and to come back to Australia.
So we know that you've been in UK previously as a optometrist, and then you moved back to UK for research. Do you mind to share some of your experience working as an international research scholar compared between UK and Australia?
So before I went to the UK, I had been working in at UNSW. I'd done my PhD with Brian Holden Vision Institute. So, you know, people don't teach there. I had done some project work with Fiona Stapleton. So I had a little bit of a taste for what it was like doing teaching and being an academic. But then when I left, the idea of these scholarships was that you go overseas, you develop links, you do research, and then you bring it back to Australia. So I had worked there before. I kind of felt like I knew the system. And so what it became apparent is that I would be in a research capacity, 80% research, and there wouldn't be opportunity to do undergraduate teaching in that capacity. So what I did to keep my teaching skills is I started to do scientific writing, writing for the professional magazines. So I went to Moorfields Eye Hospital, and it's affiliated with University College London, and they have the research facility next door to the hospital, so the Institute of Ophthalmology. I never felt really like I was working for a university in that sense.
Okay.
And I guess when I got there, because the fellowship gave you salary and it gave you living expenses, but it didn't give you any project money. It was very difficult in the first year to do anything because I didn't have any funds. So I'd spent most of the first year grant writing, and because I had gone on a certain fellowship and I had a proposal with that, and the researcher that I was aligning with, my supervisor, hadn't done research in that field for a number of years. And so it was like starting up again. And I had to connect with people that had worked on that research project in the past. So Cherry Radford, I worked with during the time that I was there. So that was great to have that knowledge that was there. I had, when I was there during my PhD, I had gone over to Moorfields Hospital and recruited patients from there. And so I had that connection already, and that I think facilitated the fact that I got the fellowship. So for example, I was doing genetics, and I had connected with Professor Alison Hardcastle, who's a professor of genetics at the Institute of Ophthalmology. So when I got there, I had like lab space with her. After the first year, I finally got, you know, some funds and started working and recruiting patients. What happened was that we had an outbreak of acanthamoeba keratitis, which is the disease that I was investigating. So I had set up the research project, and when I started it, we had this outbreak occurring. So there were many more patients than I expected to recruit. So the project became, you know, a little bit hard to manage.
Yeah.
There was an appetite in the UK at the time for engagement with the patient community. The research project that I've been working on, the acanthamoeba keratitis patients, that we had about 40 of them there, which is because it's a rare disease, that was incredible. And they just reveled in the atmosphere of being able to share their stories and be listened to and to empathize with other people. And so from that, I decided that we would try to perpetuate those. The other thing that happened was that in the waiting room, I met one of the first people that I recruited for my study was a lady called Irene Akeshas, and she had designed this no water symbol to go on contact lens packaging, because the major avoidable risk for acanthamoeba keratitis is water exposure with contact lenses. And she had been talking to lots of people and realized that contact lens wearers weren't aware of this risk. So I kind of teamed up with her to make her campaign more visible with professionals. We took it to the US last year. I think it was the year before in Australia. We just launched it here. So it ultimately, my experience of being in the UK was that I had an opportunity to engage with this group of patients, and that really changed how I looked at research. But there's only so much you can do with your time. You know, in the second year that I was there, other corneal researchers said, oh, you know, you're doing such a good job, can you come and help me? Like, you know, I've got this research project. So I ended up with 3 projects, with mine out of control, and it was you know, so that was a little bit hard to manage, and it had repercussions. And what I have learned now is that, you know, if I did that time again, I would plan a lot more carefully. I would be more targeted in what I did. And yeah, but it was a big learning curve. I don't regret it, but it would have been a lot less stress for people if I'd have reined it in a little bit.
So, Nicole, taking a leaf out of the learning curve that you were mentioning, what tips you would suggest for scholars moving, let's say, from Australia to UK? How was it, the adjustment culturally as well as like networking wise?
It's very situational, because I had been in an environment that I was very comfortable with, and then I went into a different environment, and you have to really engage with your networking skills. And I hadn't been a confident networker before, but I had to learn, and that was what I think helped me to get, you know, as much of the research done as I could, because I did rally people around me, and I did that through networking and engaging with the culture. When you move countries and it's a different ethics framework, is really difficult. So I think one of the things that helped me is having those touch points before I actually moved there.
When you're saying that you have the government grant help you to stay there for 2 years, and then where is the venue that you get the grant for your postdoc project in UK?
Yeah, so when I was there, we had the opportunity to apply for Fight for Sight UK. Okay. So we got a couple of grants through them. They were small grants, but I didn't need a lot of money, so it was just a starter, so that was good. I got an industry project with J&J, and so that was helpful, and that had sort of sprung from my connections and networking previously. It's very difficult to cold call industry, I think. You know, you need to build up those connections prior. They were the main things, but also the hospital had a special trustees. Yep. Now it's changed to the Moorfields Eye Charity. And so they had a funding stream that you could apply for. Mostly in the hospital, though, you need to be attached to a clinician. It was generally an ophthalmologist. So you kind of had to have a sponsor.
And how about the situation in Australia right now? Like if somebody who has not graduated from Australia, but wants to go there for their postdoctoral training, what would you suggest them?
For postdocs in Australia, it's very difficult at the moment. So you need to have a lot of money to have a full-time postdoc. And most of us don't have the big funds that would allow that. We are starting to write into the funding streams, even our salaries, because the university system in Australia, we were very reliant on overseas students, and we've had to cut back an awful lot. For overseas postdocs, I'm not sure whether there are funding streams that you could apply to. I've been primarily focused on PhD students, so we can offer scholarships through the university to do PhD training, but I think it's much harder to do postdocs. Yeah. I was listening to our Associate Dean talk about pathways after PhD. And he said, you know, like less than 1% actually have an academic pathway and go on to be a lecturer. The lecturer, you have a lot of teaching and administration commitment. So it's not necessarily an easy path, but there are many other jobs in industry, in other fields, like clinical research organizations. There are a wealth of jobs that we sometimes don't think about. You know, we think either, okay, well, I'm going to do a postdoc, which is research, or I'm going to be an academic and do teaching and research. But there's a lot of other options as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was really informational for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Dr. Jinjin Yu from Australia. She is currently a research lead in University of Sydney. Do you mind to introduce yourself a little bit to us, and also what is your career path from you getting the PhD to now?
Hello everyone. So I'm from University of Sydney. I work at Safeside Institute as an academic. I have my own independent funding. So I graduated, my PhD was awarded in 2012 from University of New South Wales, also in Australia. I was an international student. I received a scholarship to do my PhD. And after I graduated, I started as a casual research assistant first until I got my award. I transferred to being a postdoc, worked full-time for a few years, then have families, changed to part-time, postdoc years. Yeah, and then start to have small grants at the beginning, but then bigger grants later, and currently running multiple projects across different areas, but mainly in cornea research.
As far as I know, you were an international student. So what is the visa status were you at, or are you a permanent resident?
Based on my experience, when I graduated my bachelor, I had an honors degree, and I didn't have PR, permanent residency, so I was not entitled for the national scholarship. But my supervisor at that time, I think I'm a really good student. My supervisor at that time really wanted to give me a scholarship and support me. He wrote a letter to the migration office in Australia, and to explain that if I can have a PR, I will be able to get the scholarship and I can continue to do research with him in his area. I started my PhD as an international student with the hope that I will be a PR and I can get the scholarship. So roughly about almost a year, I have my permanent residency, and then I got the scholarship. And the very nice thing is they actually pay back my previous spendings.
What is the life as being a postdoc and early researcher in Australia, and why you choose to stay in Australia? Have you ever thought of going to other countries to pursue your career?
So yeah, after graduating, I was actually thinking that I maybe need to go to different countries and then really settle which country I need to be. But I was married, yeah, and also cultural background, so I have a lot of how do I say, influence from family to stay in an area first. So at that time I thought, fine, that at least let me get a job in Australia, and then I can think about it later. But once I got the job as a postdoc in Australia, something that I didn't expect, which is to get a grant, become the main drive of a postdoc career. Let's say research is the key, but you do need to get your own grant so that you can be independent. So I started to write grant, and I was actually really lucky that the first year I really got early career support from University of Sydney's internal grant. And then the second year I got another internal grant, and each grant was lasting 1 year. So these 2 years I couldn't leave. And then the third year I started to get a little bit, bigger grants. I start to get some eye-specific grants. So almost every year I get some grant there to keep me going. And I thought, this is my responsibility. And also start to have students. So things just started stacking up. So I just didn't actually have the chance to really go to another place. So I stayed here, but I thought the good thing is I actually see researchers from around the world to come to, safe side and come to University of Sydney. So I get to know them and know their experience. And I also sponsored a visitor fellow from China who's here for 1 year and extended, and we actually wrote a grant together. And I had international students, so it kind of all goes well. I mean, I didn't really go to another country, but I had some experience.
Awesome, Jingjing. I think that's a really vast experience you have had, even though it's been in one country. So we were wondering if you can give us some tips to other young investigators on grant writing.
Yeah, so my experience, I actually did write down a few key points I really like to share. First of all, I will not consider myself as a very successful grant writer, even though I have grants. So the first point I wanted to kind of come across is you do need to think about grant writing from day one. When I say day one, it means only if you want to have your own research, otherwise you don't need to do this. But if you don't want to have your own research, you need to start to think, how can I get a grant? How can I design this project so it's more attractive? So you actually had to look at the government policy, university strategy. They're actually quite important. And when I began my research, I was doing mostly basic research.
Yeah.
And I got really little grants, like really small grants, lasting just tiny little bit of your research project. Did not get any big grant. So I started to read, really carefully the national strategy, the university strategy, the major grants, what they rank, how their guidelines, and the grants that has been pastly successful. And I realized that the strategy, the future is in the translational research, at least in Australia. And now if you are still doing basic research and not showing your research have some future in translational, you won't be able to get big grants. For big grants, you in a competition with every top researcher nationally in a team, and if you're not fitting the national strategy or interests, it's just very hard to get it. So that's the first thing. You actually need to think big picture. What does this country want? What does the university want? Is your research aligned with this big picture? And then the second is really your team. I mean, you can, have invested your grants, so you're being really, really excellent. But you can also be part of a multidisciplinary team. So if you can demonstrate that you can work with the people, you actually should start to explore working with people outside your field and think, how can we bring it together to make a project that come across different disciplinary? If you can do that, then that's another chance to get really good grant. Then the third is really listen to people's comment. You give your proposal to other people to review. They come back with sometimes ridiculous comments, but you probably need to think about why. Maybe they just don't understand your grant. So maybe you need to make your grants like really understandable by other people. Any grants you share with people outside your field, you get their feeling. If they're not excited by you, this is something that you need to do. You need to really make it more exciting, because it's almost like an advertisement of your project.
Do you consider you have a postdoc?
Yeah, so I don't think actually, well, I think in Australia, at least when I start my job, postdoc isn't a training position. It's already independent research. So from day one, I start as a postdoc, I was asked to write grants. So the third year was the time that the team of my group leader was saying, look, if none of us getting any grant, we're not going to continue the research. And that got me, because I thought I'm working for someone. But no, I think in Australia, after your PhD, become a postdoc, you start to work for yourself. So I told my boss at Liton, I said, look, you have to think about research strategy. So that was the year I started to take initiative. So we had a discussion, like strategy discussion, and this research strategy discussion is now happening every year. within our group. So we always have a strategy. Are we aligned with our own interests, the national interests? Is this project gonna generating something that's attracting grant, or mainly just generate something to be published as a paper?
When I'm in here as a postdoc, I have to write grants as well. But then I'm never like being independent for my PI. I'm not so sure it is the case in Australia as well.
Yeah, so I think it's a group it depending on the group, how big the group is, how small the group is, and what the team leader is like. But generally in Australia, you have grants for early career academic. So these are the grants that your boss, who past that stage, cannot apply. So you will be your chief investigator to apply for these grants, like early career, mid-career. So they are grants just for you. And then in terms of so in my experience in my group, we were really small. When I started, it was only 3 people. I was the only postdoc, so I'm the only one doing scientific work, so I had to do the research direction. The direction was given by him at that time at the beginning, but then you will just through like the strategy talk, research discussion, I was allowed to develop my own direction. And the reason that he hired me is because I can give scientific kind of insight. So we work quite well. So I didn't really have, I never really worked just for his project. I was always allowed to develop my own kind of thinking and my own way of my own direction. Yeah, but it's always good to stay close with your collaborators and your supervisor, now my mentor, because they bring in kind of new collaborators to you, and they can be chief investigator, not the lead investigator, but chief investigator to your grant. So together you will have a more outstanding team than just yourself. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experience, particularly in Australia. I think it's very helpful, particularly for us in America. They actually have different culture difference in terms of the career development process, and then we can actually see aspect from a postdoc, which is very difficult to get, and then her experience to us, and then that will help us or other young investigators to further think where they should go, which way they should go. And thank you so much for your tips and then how to write a grant. That's amazing.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And I would like to thank especially all the guests, that is Dr. Liton, Dr. Zulliger, Dr. Kart, and Jinjin. So, and I would also like to acknowledge our friend Tim, who actually has helped us in editing the interview very expertly. So, but we are actually running out of time. So we would like to open it up for questions for about 5 to 10 minutes. So if anybody has questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask.
So I got a first question asking if they have young kids in town, if so, how did it affect the relocation? I think that could be a question for Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Yes. So yeah, I did have 2 kids, and it was good for me in that I went to the UK where my husband's family was, and we so we kind of knew we had a support system, but it was very different for my kids. The schooling system was different, so took them out of the Australian school system, put them into the UK. And then when they went back to Australia, I remember, they hadn't learnt their timetables in the UK, and they were I think my son got 2 out of 50, for a test. And it was just really quite different. And so I think, it was a great opportunity for them to get to know their, a different culture. We did lots of traveling and things like that. But there were things that I didn't anticipate that are, are drawbacks.
Yeah, I think having kids for like traveling and not staying, knowing which way to go is a very difficult problem. So I have a comment from Professor Peter Branneman, and then he mentioned about that postdoc are no more cheap. And I think can anyone answer this question? I think it's compared from the perspective in the industry. Am I correct?
Yeah, now the NIH pay scales are very different for postdocs. What it was before and now, it's totally different. Right. Like Paloma is a very good friend of mine. I was a postdoc at Duke when Paloma started her faculty. And we know what it is now, like the scales are very, very different. So that's why I mentioned that in the comment. So the postdoc scale at, when you start now is like 53,000, which is what NIH recommends. So that's good money to start as a postdoc, definitely.
Absolutely, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have Rahel in the discussion today, but if anybody can give us an input of how much the starting salary for postdocs in the industry are, then probably we can have have an insight into what Rahel was coming from.
So I'm going to start
yeah, I need to follow up on the Padu's comment. Now there is not just a university that NIH decides the salary. Now when you get into an H1, the Department of Labor is the one setting the salaries for the postdocs, and they are coming very, very high salaries. And this is indeed one of the reasons by which many laboratories are starting to now sponsor H1 visas, because the salaries that are coming from the Department of Labor are completely beyond the funding that you get from NIH grant money. So there is an imbalance there that I am not sure how this is going to work in the future. So that's the other option for getting the green card. Yeah, the Department of Labor is coming very strong with salaries, and NIH funding is not increasing.
Yeah.
Right.
The modular budget is still 250,000, but the postdoc salary has gone skyrocketing now. So
what is the input of the postdoc salary in Australia? We have like 2 guests from Australia. Probably they can give us some input there.
I may start first and then let Nicole to talk about it. So the beginning salary, first of all, depending different universities, so they have different package and things like that. But I suspect there won't be too much difference. So at least this year, the starting salary for a postdoc, which means that the person has a PhD, and is about 100K. And yeah, at University of Sydney, that includes everything. But if you're applying for postdoc fellowship in Australia, the salary that the government gave to you is lower than university standard. So there are salary shortfall. And when that happens, you need to talk to university and they will actually pay for the shortfall. So if you get a fellowship and you get a position at university, basically means that's your starting salary around 100K in Australia. Yeah. Pass to Nicole.
Sorry, I was just going to say that's 100 Australian dollars, so not US dollars. But it is difficult, I think, as a postdoc in Australia. But the salaries, we used to hear about this, the postdoc salaries in the US being, like so small, and it was really, how would you, it would have been very difficult to live. So I absolutely agree that the salaries should be larger, but our governments need to invest in research. That's the bottom line, like, I think.
With the discrepancies in the postdoc salaries between different countries, such as Australia and the US, has anyone had any experience where they've wanted to fund, for example, an Australian postdoc in an Australian lab and have that cross country sort of international collaboration, but perhaps not been able to fund an Australian postdoc because of the differences in the cost, or in any country, Europe, for example?
I might say that because Australia has high, well, relatively high postdoc salary in this country, in Australia. So the salary in Australia is not a low salary for people beginning their career. When we have international students people coming to Australia, sorry, not the Australian people going out to the international, but we have international people coming to Australia. At least in my experience, we actually expect them to carry some money around. So if they come without any funding, no salary, then it's almost like you are competing with the local Australia postdoc to that particular position. We don't have additional funding to actually fund an international research to do research in Australia. It's almost like equally in the market job. If you don't bring your own money, you have to compete with the local. And because of visa and a lot of the issues, generally it's hard to hire international researcher. So, but what can be done is if you are applying for international positions in Australia, and because you're doing eye research, and there are many ophthalmologists in Australia, I have to say that the hospitals sometimes have their own foundation, their own money. So what people can do, and I've seen people done that, is to get the clinicians that the leading clinicians in the field, contacting them, because they sometimes have some foundation money saved there for supporting an international fellow in the first year. A few of international researchers that coming to Safe Side in one of our groups, not my group, but other groups in Safe Side, and that's how they get their kind of salary covered, but it's at a very basic salary. Whatever the foundation have is what you get. It's not at the level of university postdoc salary level. So
thank you. We have a question from Dr. Liton. How easy or difficult is it for international students to get funding in Australia?
Yeah, I say that it's hard. It's very hard. What you can do is it's really supervisor dependent. So firstly, you have to find if you choose a supervisor that has no funding for international students, basically as an international student to get a scholarship in Australia, it's almost, the chance is really, really low. Australia just doesn't have, like in terms of national scheme, doesn't have many, probably one or two. I mean, this year, like Kart fundings, I don't even know if they have any scholarship for international students. So you have to look into your supervisor, specific university. I mean, I know at University of Sydney, sometimes the supervisor apply for a scheme called ARC scholarship scheme. And that means if anyone who are coming to do his or her project, they actually have this ARC scholarship funding to fund that student. And it doesn't matter. I mean, mostly it has to be domestic students, but I think they now have, you can get some exemptions as an international student to work on that scheme. That's what I heard of. I haven't heard, and then other international students that are coming to Australia, they usually get their scholarship from their country, or they are their country and Australia partner scholarship, so they actually get that scheme to come to do research. That's how much I know about international students get the scholarship in Australia.
So, but you mentioned that there is funding for graduate students. So usually the international graduate students leave Australia once they are done with the PhD, they come back to their home country.
Yeah, so that's what I thought that people do, but what the reality is, I mean, you know, 3 of the students back to my time that came to Australia with a scholarship, they were supposed to go back to their country, but you know, 2 of them stayed. So I guess there's certain things.
There are ways.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Nicole's have like many also PhD students as well. Probably she might be able to more give an insight of if the student's staying or not.
Yeah, I think that is that experience at the University of New South Wales is that a lot of we do encourage a lot of international PhDs, and they come with, you know, great experience in their country, and they really build a great rich community of PhDs, and then often, you know, they would like to stay, and you know, they've built up experience in their supervisor's field, and they're very valued, and it is, you do, then that supervisor needs to provide the funding, and that is difficult and becoming more difficult in Australia. We do try to encourage people, I think, to go into you know, even in Australia, and work with other groups, because I think that is really important. If you stay with your PhD supervisor group, you know, you limit your ability to learn and grow. So I think it is important to get some outside experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, completely going overseas, but it may be meaning, you know, collaborating with another group, or, you know, looking for ways that you can extend your networks and your opportunities.
I think I got a comment from Himo Candles. I think he's no longer in the chat, but he mentioned about that the international scholar going back to Australia, there's a global talent visa that would be the best way to apply permanent resident. But I just reading the chat here, but I have no idea what that is. If anyone knows, that would be great.
That's how to get a visa in Australia. Like, if you are an international student, that scheme, you know, has been used quite a lot, but it doesn't give you salary.
Thank you everyone. A big thank you for all our attendees for coming today for our inaugural ISER YI seminar series, and thanks to our amazing invited speakers for sharing your career advice and insights. If you haven't already signed up for ISER membership, please visit the ISER website, www.iser.org, to sign up. And this is our first ever seminar series as the ISER YI, so please give us any feedback. The link is in the chat box, and you can also find the extended interviews, because we did have to cut them down to fit them within the hour. So please feel free to check out the full interviews on our YouTube and subscribe. We'll be having some more seminar series coming up. Our next one will be in October, so stay tuned, and we will advertise that in due time. Thank you all again for attending, and thanks, and see you next time.
And we will also put this one into the YouTube channel as well.
This one will also be.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.